48 hours. That was all the time Jamaica's Prime Minister, Andrew Holness, gave Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré to issue a public apology. The ultimatum was direct, unyielding, and carried the weight of diplomatic pressure. On the surface, it seemed like a typical dispute between two world leaders, but beneath the headlines lay a story of courage, confrontation, and the undeniable power of truth. What drove Holness to set such a tight deadline? And why did Traoré refuse to comply despite the looming threat of international consequences? To understand this story, we must look beyond the ultimatums and examine the deeper currents of politics, public sentiment, and accountability that shaped this extraordinary confrontation. In the ornate chambers of the Jamaican Parliament, whispers of tension had already begun to circulate. Holness's announcement was a calculated move, strategically delivered to both a domestic and international audience. He accused Traoré of damaging Jamaica's reputation and framed the situation as a matter that required immediate correction. On national television, the Prime Minister made it clear: 48 hours to apologize, or face severe consequences that could impact diplomatic relations, trade agreements, and even regional alliances. The clock began ticking, and with it, speculation soared. Diplomatic channels buzzed with urgency, and foreign correspondents tried to decipher the motives behind Holness's ultimatum. Was it simply a defense of national honor, or did it conceal deeper political calculations? Citizens across Jamaica and Burkina Faso alike began following every report, every official statement, trying to understand whether this was a diplomatic stunt or the prelude to a more serious confrontation. As the ultimatum landed, Traoré faced a pivotal choice. On one hand, a public apology could prevent immediate diplomatic fallout. On the other, it would compromise his principles and risk alienating supporters who viewed him as a champion of transparency and justice. In a carefully prepared address in Kingston, Traoré delivered his response, not with concessions, but with a bold exposé. Traoré spoke candidly about corruption, systemic mismanagement, and the hidden networks that allowed public funds to be siphoned away while ordinary citizens struggled. A nation cannot afford to turn corruption into its operating system, he declared, his voice firm yet measured. The speech struck a chord not only for its content, but also for its timing. It came at the precise moment when public attention was highest, creating a dramatic tension that captured global headlines. Traoré's words reverberated through the halls of power in Jamaica. Some politicians were visibly unsettled. Others chose to leave in protest. His critique cut deep, touching on long-standing practices that many preferred to ignore. But outside of these political chambers, the reaction was strikingly different. Ordinary citizens, particularly the younger generation, gathered in public squares and streets, discussing the revelations. What had started as a foreign diplomatic issue quickly evolved into a domestic conversation about integrity, governance, and the responsibilities of leadership. The streets buzzed with debates and dialogue. Social media platforms lit up as citizens shared excerpts from Traoré's speech, analyzing each point and comparing it to their own experiences. It was a moment of civic engagement rarely seen in Jamaica, a spontaneous, grassroots response to a foreign leader speaking truth to power. Within hours, small demonstrations began to emerge. Citizens demanded accountability, transparency, and reform. Signs read, "Truth is not disrespect." Apology? No. Accountability? Yes. The momentum grew rapidly as young activists used social media to organize rallies, broadcast live updates, and connect with like-minded individuals across the country. What began as scattered discussions became a coordinated call for justice and scrutiny of leadership practices. This public mobilization reflected a profound cultural shift. While traditional politics often focused on partisanship and hierarchy, Traoré's speech catalyzed a movement that centered on truth, ethics, and citizen empowerment. Analysts and journalists began framing the event as a historic moment, a bold diplomatic confrontation that had tangible domestic implications, highlighting the interplay between international diplomacy and local civic action. As the 48-hour countdown progressed, tension mounted. Every hour brought new speculation. Would Traoré yield under pressure, or would he remain steadfast? Holness, meanwhile, maintained a public posture of firmness, projecting both authority and concern. Diplomats and international observers were left to predict the next move, weighing potential outcomes against the political and economic stakes involved. Traoré, however, remained calm. Behind the scenes, advisors debated strategies, communications teams prepared statements, and intelligence networks monitored public sentiment. Every action and word was calculated, not for immediate appeasement, but for a larger narrative of integrity and principle. When Traoré finally addressed the nation, his speech was precise and relentless. He outlined how corruption had infiltrated essential sectors, from healthcare to education, diverting resources to private accounts while the vulnerable suffered. He exposed networks of hidden transactions, challenging traditional norms of political protection and secrecy. Money meant for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure should serve the people, not hidden accounts, he emphasized. A nation's strength lies in its commitment to transparency, accountability, and justice. To compromise on these values is to compromise the future. The speech was more than an address, it was a manifesto. It resonated with citizens who had long suspected mismanagement but lacked the platform or leadership to articulate their frustrations. Traoré's words provided clarity, validation, and a rallying point for those seeking systemic change. As Traoré's speech circulated, Jamaica's streets began to transform. What started as casual conversations outside cafes and bus stops quickly became organized assemblies. Young people, long frustrated with political stagnation, took to the streets with banners, megaphones, and smartphones. The message was clear: truth is not disrespect, and accountability cannot be ignored. In cities like Kingston and Montego Bay, protesters gathered at key government buildings, chanting slogans inspired by Traoré's speech. They were not just responding to a foreign leader, they were responding to the systemic inequities that Traoré had highlighted. Local communities found in his words a mirror of their daily struggles: underfunded hospitals, failing schools, and the frustration of citizens ignored by those in power. The youth's involvement added a new dimension. Unlike traditional political demonstrations, this wave was decentralized and digitally connected. Young Jamaicans streamed live footage, analyzed official statements, and used social media to fact-check claims made by politicians. Hashtags inspired by Traoré's message began trending, amplifying the protests beyond city streets to a global audience. Political analysts noted that this kind of engagement was unprecedented. The youth were not merely followers, they were active participants shaping the narrative. The confrontation was no longer only about the leaders. It had become a dialogue between citizens and governance structures, facilitated by modern communication technologies. Inside Parliament, reactions were mixed. Some lawmakers condemned Traoré's speech as insulting, framing it as interference by a foreign leader. Others, though quieter, could not ignore the resonance of his message with the public. The tension highlighted a growing divide between political elites and ordinary citizens, an undercurrent that had been building for years, but now demanded attention. Journalists covering the story reported on walkouts, heated debates, and internal memos circulated by politicians concerned about public perception. Every action, every word became a focal point, fueling both domestic and international discourse. The story quickly crossed borders. Major news outlets from Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond began framing this confrontation as one of the boldest diplomatic exchanges of the year. Commentators debated whether Traoré's refusal to apologize signaled a shift in international diplomacy, one in which leaders were willing to prioritize principles over protocol. Media coverage varied in tone. Some highlighted Traoré's courage and moral clarity, praising him for standing with ordinary citizens. Others focused on potential risks, speculating about long-term diplomatic consequences, trade disruptions, or even regional tensions. Yet one thread was undeniable. This confrontation had captured global attention. turning a 48-hour ultimatum into a story watched worldwide. The online world became a parallel arena for this conflict. Citizens, activists, and commentators dissected speeches, statements, and political reactions in real time. Infographics illustrating corruption patterns circulated widely. Memes condensed Traoré's boldest lines into digestible messages, and discussion forums debated the implications for both nations. The digital engagement created a feedback loop. Street protests inspired online discussion, which in turn energized more public gatherings. Traditional media had been forced to follow the digital pulse, amplifying the story further and creating a multi-layered public discourse. With hours left on the ultimatum, tension reached its peak. Speculation about whether Traoré would concede intensified. Diplomats quietly lobbied behind the scenes, discussing possible compromise statements or mediated solutions. Holness, maintaining a public posture of authority, reminded audiences of the potential consequences of ignoring the ultimatum. Yet Traoré remained resolute. Behind closed doors, his team meticulously reviewed every statement, ensuring that public communication reflected not only political strategy but also ethical commitment. Each hour passed with heightened anticipation, as both governments prepared for the moment of truth. As the clock approached zero, Jamaica's streets were filled with anticipation. Citizens gathered in plazas, chanting, observing, and waiting. Across the world, news agencies provided live updates, dissecting every development, while analysts speculated about long-term political fallout. The atmosphere was electric, a rare moment when diplomacy, civic activism, and global attention converged. Traoré's final address was deliberate. He spoke to the people, reaffirming his commitment to truth, justice, and accountability. His words resonated deeply with citizens who had long felt neglected by traditional power structures. "I will not apologize for standing with the people," he declared, his statement echoing in the streets, on social media, and across international news channels. The 48 hours came to an end. Holness' ultimatum officially expired, but the impact of Traoré's defiance was far from over. What began as a simple diplomatic demand had catalyzed a wave of civic engagement, forcing citizens to confront political realities they had often ignored. The conversation extended far beyond apologies, touching on systemic reform, transparency, and the role of leadership in serving public interests. Observers noted that this moment marked a turning point. For the first time, ordinary citizens witnessed a foreign leader openly challenging norms while simultaneously empowering them to question authority. The repercussions were both immediate and long-term, promising to reshape political dynamics in ways yet unseen. This confrontation demonstrated a fundamental truth. Real power lies not just in political offices, but in informed and engaged citizens. Traoré's speech had acted as a catalyst, but the movement that followed belonged to the people. It illustrated the growing influence of youth-led activism, digital communication, and the global interconnectedness of civic awareness. The streets remained alive with discussion, social media buzzed, and analysts continued to debate the implications. Leaders across the region were forced to consider how public accountability could no longer be ignored, and ordinary citizens were reminded that their voices mattered more than ever. The 48-hour ultimatum had passed, yet its consequences were just beginning to unfold. Traoré's refusal to apologize left Holness and the Jamaican establishment facing a public now emboldened by clarity and courage. Citizens, activists, and journalists continued to dissect every statement, every action, holding leadership accountable in ways previously unseen. The streets were no longer merely arenas of protest. They had become spaces of reflection, dialogue, and civic education. Global media coverage did not stop with the ultimatum. Analysts published op-eds, investigative journalists tracked the flow of public funds, and political commentators debated the ethical and diplomatic dimensions of the confrontation. The incident became a case study in modern diplomacy, how a single, leader's principled stance can catalyze public engagement and create lasting discourse about governance and accountability. Traoré's stand illuminated weaknesses within political and administrative systems. For Jamaica, It sparked conversations about corruption, transparency, and the role of public oversight. Internationally, it challenged traditional notions of diplomatic etiquette, demonstrating that moral clarity and citizen support can sometimes outweigh protocol. The confrontation served as a mirror, reflecting the gaps between leadership rhetoric and public expectations, urging societies to rethink how power and responsibility intersect. One of the most remarkable outcomes was the sustained civic engagement among youth. Social media campaigns evolved into structured advocacy initiatives, community forums discussed practical reforms, and young leaders emerged with renewed confidence. Traoré's speech had not only challenged political authority, it had inspired citizens to take ownership of governance, proving that accountability is not just a demand, but a shared responsibility. As the dust settled, the story of Ibrahim Traoré and Andrew Holness remained more than a diplomatic skirmish. It became a narrative about courage, principles, and the power of truth. 48 hours could have ended quietly, yet it sparked conversations, protests, and movements that will resonate for years. The ultimate lesson was clear. Accountability cannot be enforced through ultimatums alone. It must be embraced by both leaders and the people they serve. In the end, the confrontation left a lasting question for the world. When integrity confronts protocol, who truly holds the power, the office or the voice of the people? The answer, as this historic episode demonstrated, may lie not in the demands of a single leader, but in the courage of those who refuse to remain silent.